So asanteni sana. We have, Your Excellency, very few remarks from our sponsors, and I want to take this opportunity to welcome our remarks from our platinum sponsors, starting with Ambassador Meg Whitman, the US Ambassador to Kenya, to come and make our remarks. Karibu Balozi.
Thank you very much. Abare Saleo, good afternoon. President Ruto, governors, distinguished guests, the best sentence in the English language, all protocols observed. It is a pleasure to be in Eldoret at this Devolution Conference, my first, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you today. Ushirikano wa Kenya na Marekani ni imara. Umajengwa kwa miaka sitini ya maadili na maslahi ya pamoja. Our partnership has enhanced security and improved the lives of Kenyans and Americans. Since I arrived in Kenya, my team and I have been focused on strengthening the U.S.-Kenya trade investment relationship in coordination with the Kenyan government. The presentation that you are about to hear is one that I have given many times over the past several months to encourage businesses to invest in Africa and Kenya. I want you to hear the pitch too, and hope that you use the data for your own pitches. And I welcome you to add your county to this story. And the story is, why Africa, why Kenya, and why your county? Whether that's Homa Bay, or Kilifi, or Nairobi, or Mombasa. Let us seize this moment to increase bilateral trade and investment to all our citizens. Now, just after I arrived, it became clear to me we needed to update the narrative on Africa. For example, when I was a CEO, I'll be honest, I probably thought about Africa 1% of the time. Many businesses I managed were elsewhere. But if I were back in the boardroom today, Africa would be on my radar for two very simple reasons: supply chain diversification and net zero emissions. If the war in Ukraine and the COVID pandemic taught us anything from a business perspective, it taught us that single sourcing your supply chain from any one country is not smart. Single sourcing is a recipe for supply chain disruption and shortage. Today, every company is looking for new places to diversify their supply chain. Now, what the war in Ukraine and the pandemic did to spur supply chain diversification, climate change has done for energy use. Businesses are pushing for net zero emissions to meet their climate change mitigation goals. And Kenya, as you know, generates 93% of its electricity from renewable sources, and this percentage is only going to go up with geothermal, solar, and wind investments. And to further emphasize this point, ponder these words from a CEO of a major consumer tech company who I hope to bring to Kenya. He said, "Supply chain diversification is now an essential element of our business, and so is the need to be totally green. In that sense, Kenya seems to offer us a 1-2 punch for success." Now, at the embassy, we've been doing a lot of trade and investment data analysis since my arrival. And what I have learned has been surprising and paints a far more dynamic business outlook for Africa than most Americans understand. And here are some data points that I found particularly interesting, and ones that I share often with American businesses. Why Africa is the first question American businesses have. By 2015, 1 in 4 humans, a quarter of the world's population, will live on the African continent. And 1/3 of the working age people will live on the African continent. It's the youngest population on the world. 60% of the population is under 25. And in my view, Africa is the last and largest emerging market and offers the last big supply chain and consumer prospects, much like the opportunities we saw in Southeast Asia 20 years ago. Now, that's how I'm talking about Africa to U.S. businesses. Let's zoom in on how I'm talking about why Kenya should be everyone's destination in Africa. Kenya is the most stable democracy in Africa. Kenya is the gateway to the East African market of almost 500 million consumers. Kenya is the regional logistics hub. Kenya is the leading regional financial hub, and Kenya, with its Silicon Savannah and super smart engineers, is the region's ICT hub. Kenya is a leading destination for foreign direct investment and venture capital, and Kenya has a young, educated, entrepreneurial, and English-speaking workforce. Kenya generates, as I said, over 93% of its energy from renewable sources, and Kenya's largest export market is the United States. Let me repeat, Kenya's largest export is the United States, and we feel Kenya is ready for liftoff as it diversifies. Let me unpack a couple of these areas. Democracy. I arrived in Kenya days before the August 22 general elections. What I witnessed was nothing short of remarkable. Kenya held what many analysts and commentators say was the freest, fairest, and most credible election in Kenyan history. The elections were observed by international and local election organizations, and the results were upheld by the Kenyan Supreme Court, and power was transferred orderly and peacefully at the time. Now, gateway to East Africa. As I said, Kenya is the gateway to East Africa. 80% of East African regional trade passes through Kenya's Mombasa port. In addition, Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi is the busiest airport in East Africa, served by 40 passenger airlines and 25 cargo carriers, including FedEx and DHL. Kenya also has some excellent infrastructure, such as the Standard Gauge Railway, a series of new roads, and modern ports. From a financial and technology hub perspective, Kenya is already the regional financial hub for East Africa. Several international banks have been present in Nairobi for decades, and five major global financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have established their regional headquarters in Nairobi. The region's regional stock market sits in Nairobi, and the city hosts the necessary legal, accounting, and consultancy services to preserve and accelerate this. There we go. Okay, great. Thank you. Nairobi also has a very vibrant technology community known as Silicon Savannah, and the Kenyan government is committed to establishing Kenya as the premier destination for tech sector investment and innovation in Africa. Many leading U.S. companies are already in Kenya, including the names that you see on the screen. Emerging, but also hugely impactful, having a little trouble there. Emerging, but also hugely impactful Kenyan tech companies like Copia Global, Semiconductor Limited, Twiga Foods, Market Force, Power Financial Wellness, and others are here in Kenya. I've met these companies, I've visited their operations, And what I see happening here has many of the critical components that make Silicon Savannah an even bigger success. Now, at the nexus of finance and technology sits one of the most impressive companies I have ever seen, M-Pesa. M-Pesa has annual revenues of over $1 billion US, $360 billion of gross market value flowed through the platform last year. And it has an open API of over 60,000 developers. M-Pesa has over 50 million customers in 7 countries and is involved in over 70% of Kenyan transactions, powers over 5 million businesses, and 60% of Kenya's annual GDP flows through it. Let me say that again. 60% of Kenya's GDP flows through M-Pesa. And let me tell you, I know a little something about this industry, having bought and owned PayPal at eBay. And I assure you, M-Pesa is extraordinary. M-Pesa alone demonstrates the brilliant business minds at work in Kenya devising African solutions to global problems. Foreign direct investment and venture capital, Kenya has attracted significant foreign direct investment and is a leading destination for venture capital. Interestingly, when venture capital flows decreased 35% globally last year, total funding in Africa actually increased 8%. Even more impressive, while venture capital to Nigeria was down 36% and essentially flat in South Africa, funding to Kenya increased by 33%. You go, Kenya. Adjusted for GDP, Kenya receives significantly more venture capital than anywhere else on the continent, generating roughly triple the venture capital to GDP ratios of Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa. Unlike its continental competitors who attract predominantly fintech-led investments, Kenya venture capital flows are more diverse, led by e-commerce and clean tech, followed by fintech, agritech, and enterprise investments. And what's even more unique for Kenya, in 2022, Kenyan women-founded startups raised $146 million in equity, more than any other country on the entire continent. As I said, more than 90% of Kenya's on-grid electricity is currently generated from renewable sources, primarily geothermal, wind, and solar. A great example is Kapeto in Kajiado County. It's the second largest wind farm in Kenya, proudly supported by the U.S. International Development Finance Corp and Power Africa. And it is phenomenal that Kenya has committed to reaching 100% renewable energy by 2030 and is already close to achieving that goal. From a workforce perspective, Kenya is English-speaking, has high literacy rates, and strong primary, secondary, and tertiary education systems. And every firm that I have spoken to about the quality of Kenyan workforce says this: the Kenyan workforce is their best workforce in the world. As I mentioned, in 2022, the United States became Kenya's largest export market, edging ahead of neighboring Uganda. In total, Kenya exported $890 million in goods to the United States last year, and in addition, the United States exported around $600 million in goods to Kenya. So $1.5 billion in total U.S.-Kenya trade. It's fairly balanced, and it's expected to increase as the United States and Kenya negotiate a first-of-its-kind bilateral trade agreement that we hope will be done by the end of this year. And we hope this agreement will be a model for the rest of the continent once signed. So now